The sun hung low over the Texas prairie, its fading light casting long shadows across the ranch. Thomas wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve as he hauled the last bucket of water from the well. At 60, his hands were calloused, his back bent from years of toil, yet his spirit remained unbroken. Loss had carved deep lines into his face. His wife gone to fever, his children buried too young. Solitude had become his companion, and silence his comfort. But that night, as the wind whispered across the dry land, silence gave way to a fragile voice. He turned slowly, startled by the sound. There she stood, a girl of perhaps 20, slender frame trembling beneath a threadbare dress. Her apron hung loosely, fingers clutching its corners as though it might shield her from shame. Thomas had seen her work the kitchen that week, quiet and efficient, her eyes cast down. But now, in the waning light, those eyes lifted, wide and desperate, glistening with unspoken fear. Her lips moved, her voice no more than a whisper, trembling like a candle in a storm. The words cut deeper than any knife. "I'll do anything a man wants," she said again, her voice breaking, as though she had rehearsed the line too many times. She stood not with the boldness of temptation, but with the trembling of despair. Her cheeks flushed red, not with coyness, but with humiliation. Thomas felt the bucket slip slightly from his hands, rope straining against the edge of the well. He froze, stunned, every muscle in his body locked. In his 60 years, he had weathered drought, death, and loneliness, yet nothing prepared him for this moment. An innocent girl offering herself out of sheer desperation. The rancher's heart pounded heavily in his chest. He saw beyond her words, saw the weight of hunger in her hollow cheeks, the shadow of fear in her eyes. She wasn't trying to seduce him. She was trying to survive. He knew it in the way her voice cracked, in the way her hands gripped her apron, as though it were the last piece of dignity she had left. She was young, too young to carry such burdens. A storm of anger rose in Thomas, not at her, but at the world that had driven her to believe her worth was measured by a man's desire. The air between them thickened. Dust swirled, catching the last rays of sunlight, and for a moment the ranch felt like a stage set for some cruel test of his soul. Thomas's hands shook as he finally set the bucket down, the water sloshing inside. His voice caught in his throat, dry as the prairie wind. He wanted to speak, to tell her she was more than her words, but his tongue felt heavy, uncooperative. The weight of years pressed down on him, the years of loneliness, of longing for touch, of missing the comfort of his late wife. The temptation struck him like lightning, sharp and shameful, but then he looked closer. The girl's shoulders quivered beneath the fading light. Her jaw clenched, fighting back tears. She wasn't offering herself from desire nor affection. This was sacrifice, a bargain made by someone who had no other coin to spend. Thomas's chest tightened, his breath ragged. How many men before him had heard those same words and taken them without hesitation? How many had broken her spirit further, leaving her emptier than before? The thought burned him, seared through his conscience. He would not be another shadow in her suffering. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate, his boots crunching against the dry earth. The girl flinched, instinctively pulling her apron tighter. Thomas stopped short, his weathered hands rising slightly in the air, as though to show he carried no harm. His voice, when it finally broke through the silence, was low and rough, carrying both gentleness and grief. "Child," he said, though she was nearly grown. "You don't need to say such words here." His throat thickened, his voice trembling with the weight of it. "Not in my home." The girl blinked, confusion breaking through her fear. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, her shoulders shook with quiet sobs she had been holding back for too long. Tears streaked down her cheeks, glimmering in the dim light. Thomas, unsure and awkward, reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, faded and worn from years of use. He offered it without stepping closer, placing it gently on the edge of the well, where she could take it if she wished. She stared at the cloth for a long moment before slowly, hesitantly, reaching out to take it, pressing it to her damp cheeks. For Thomas, that small gesture weighed heavier than the strongest storm. He saw her vulnerability, raw and unguarded, and felt something stir inside him, something protective, almost paternal. She was not meant to beg for her place in the world. She was not meant to barter away her body in exchange for survival. He knew that now, as sure as he knew the sun would rise tomorrow. His silence stretched, but it wasn't the silence of judgment. It was the silence of a man battling his own demons, choosing a road far harder, but far more righteous. As the last light slipped below the horizon, the ranch seemed to hold its breath. The cattle lowed in the distance, the prairie stretched endless and unforgiving, and in that vast loneliness stood two souls, both scarred in different ways. Thomas took a step back, giving her space, and turned toward the cabin. "Come inside," he said finally, his voice firm yet kind. "You're tired." "You're hungry, and no one here will ask you to give more than you've already given." His words fell heavy with conviction, a promise carved in the silence of the Texas night. The girl hesitated, her eyes narrowing as though weighing whether to believe him. Trust was a fragile thing, especially for one who had been forced to live without it. But something in his weathered face, etched with loss, lined with years of quiet endurance, spoke to her. He wasn't a man of easy words, nor of deception. Slowly, with a trembling breath, she lowered her hands, her grip on her apron loosening. Her feet shifted forward, one tentative step, then another, until she stood near him. Thomas didn't move to touch her, only opened the cabin door, letting the glow of firelight spill into the darkness. The warmth of the fire beckoned her inside. She glanced back once, as though making sure this wasn't some cruel trick, then stepped through the doorway. Thomas followed, closing the door behind them with a soft thud that seemed to seal away the cold, the fear, the despair of the night. Inside, the room glowed with flickering light, shadows dancing across the wooden walls. The girl clutched the handkerchief tightly, her breath still unsteady, but a trace of relief softened her features. For the first time since she spoke those dreadful words, she felt a sliver of safety, fragile yet real. Thomas hung his hat on the wall, his boots heavy against the floorboards. He glanced at her, still standing near the door, hesitant as though afraid to take up space. "Sit," he said gently, motioning toward the table where a pot of beans simmered. She obeyed, moving with quiet steps, her eyes never leaving him. He ladled food into a bowl, setting it before her with rough, steady hands. She stared at the meal for a moment, then at him, her lips parting in silent gratitude. Thomas gave a small nod, settling into his chair opposite her, the silence now no longer suffocating, but shared. The yard was quiet but for the wind, carrying dust that swirled like ghosts across the fading horizon. Thomas stood there, staring at the young maid with eyes that saw more than her trembling frame. He didn't see a servant, nor a body offered in desperation. He saw a soul crying out for mercy. His heart clenched as he realized how close she had come to believing she was worth nothing more than what men demanded. Slowly, deliberately, he spoke the word that carried all the weight of his years. "No." A single word, steady and final, like a stone in still water. The girl flinched at first, as though rejection cut sharper than hunger. But his tone was not harsh. It was gentle, almost tender, the way a man might speak to a frightened animal. Thomas set down the bucket and stepped toward her, not with desire, but with compassion. He reached for the wool blanket draped over the fence, weathered and rough from years of use, and wrapped it around her narrow shoulders. She froze, uncertain, then shivered as warmth seeped into her bones. His touch lingered only a moment, steady and careful, before he pulled back, giving her space. Her eyes darted to his face, confusion stirring beneath the exhaustion. Men had looked at her before, looked at her in ways that stripped her of dignity, of choice. But Thomas's gaze was different. It held no hunger, no bargain, only recognition. She lowered her eyes, ashamed of her words, but his hand rested lightly on her arm, steadying her before she collapsed under the weight of shame. "Come inside," he said softly. Voice carrying more kindness than she had heard in months. She let him guide her, her steps faltering, until the cabin's door closed behind them with a firm thud. The firelight painted the walls with flickering gold, its warmth filling the silence. The girl pulled the blanket tighter, clutching it like a shield against the world. Thomas moved with deliberate slowness, removing his hat, setting it on the peg, then kneeling by the hearth to stoke the flames higher. The crackling wood filled the silence that hung between them, heavy yet unthreatening. She watched him, expecting harsh words or questions, but none came. Instead, he ladled hot stew into a bowl and placed it before her, sliding it across the rough-hewn table. "Eat," he said simply. "You need it more than I." Her hands shook as she lifted the spoon. The first taste nearly broke her composure, the warmth of beans and broth filling her hollow stomach, the comfort of being fed without demand. Tears pricked her eyes, and though she tried to hide them, Thomas saw. He didn't comment, didn't shame her. He simply sat across from her, hands folded on the table, watching the firelight flicker. It wasn't a master and a maid, nor a man and a woman. It was two survivors sharing space, their loneliness folding into something unfamiliar but steady. For the first time, she ate without fear of the cost. When the bowl was empty, she pushed it forward, whispering, "Thank you." Her voice cracked, fragile as glass. Thomas nodded, his weathered face unreadable but his eyes softer than she expected. "No thanks needed," he said. "You've worked hard here. You've earned your place." She blinked at his words, confusion giving way to disbelief. Earned her place? No man had ever spoken that way to her. Most saw only what they could take, what they could use. Her hands clenched the blanket tighter, and her shoulders began to shake again, not from cold this time, but from the release of a burden carried too long. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. His late wife's laughter echoing through the cabin, the sound of children's feet that had once filled the floorboards with life. All gone now, buried beneath years of grief and silence. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to share his fire with another soul. Looking at the girl across from him, he saw not temptation, but the fragile spark of trust flickering against the darkness. He made his choice then, not to take but to protect. The night deepened, the wind howling outside the cabin walls, but inside, a fragile peace took root. Thomas rose and pulled another blanket from the chest, spreading it over the cot by the fire. "Rest here," he told her. She hesitated, staring at him as though expecting some hidden condition. But he only moved to his own chair, leaning back with a sigh. "The storm will pass. Tomorrow's another day." She lowered herself onto the cot, clutching the blanket close, eyes never leaving him until her exhaustion overcame fear. Slowly, her breathing steadied, and the sound of sleep filled the room. Thomas sat awake long into the night, staring at the flames. He thought of the cruel world outside, of the men who would have taken her words as invitation rather than cry for help. His jaw tightened, anger simmering at the thought. But when he glanced at her sleeping form, curled like a child near the hearth, his heart softened. He had chosen mercy, where others would have chosen possession. And in that choice, he felt something stir, a quiet dignity that reminded him of the man he once was, the man his wife had loved. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. By dawn, the prairie stretched wide and endless, bathed in golden light. The girl stirred, eyes blinking open as warmth touched her face. She sat up, startled at first, then calmed when she saw Thomas still in his chair, hat resting on his knee, watching her with steady eyes. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "No grand promises, no false hope, just truth." She nodded slowly, tears glistening once again. For her, safety was rarer than gold. For him, kindness was the only wealth he had left to give. And on that morning, in a quiet Texas cabin, two broken lives began to mend. The days that followed carried the rhythm of simple survival. She cooked and swept, her hands steadying with each passing morning, her laughter timid but growing. Thomas worked the land as he always had, but now the silence of his days was broken by the sound of her voice, the presence of another heartbeat in his home. They did not speak of that first night again, but its memory lingered like a scar, painful yet vital, a reminder of a choice made in mercy. The ranch was still hard, the world still cruel, but within those walls something gentle endured. In time, the girl's eyes no longer held the same shadow of desperation. She stood straighter, spoke with more confidence, and even dared to smile. And Thomas, weathered and weary though he was, found himself softened by her resilience. He never touched her without permission, never demanded what she had once been forced to offer. Instead, he gave her the one thing no man before had given: respect. That respect grew into trust, and trust into companionship, until the lines between savior and survivor blurred into something resembling family. Neither had expected it, yet both found themselves grateful for it. Years later, when the land grew harsher and the world changed around them, the story of the old rancher and the shy maid lingered in whispers. Some said he had taken her as a wife. Others claimed she remained his faithful companion until his last breath. But the truth was simpler and far more profound. On one desperate night when the world would have consumed her, he chose not to take, but to protect. And in that choice, they both discovered something rarer than gold on the frontier. They discovered that kindness, once given, has the power to save two souls at once.